For over 1,000 years, some of the world's greatest thinkers have been locked in a philosophical duel. They've been fighting over one of the strangest, most elegant, and honestly, most infuriating arguments ever devised, a logical proof for the existence of God. Now, this isn't about faith or scripture. This is about pure reason. And it all kicks off with one totally mind-bending question. So here it is. This is the wild, audacious question at the heart of it all. Can you really just sit in a room with zero evidence from the outside world and reason your way to the existence of a supreme being, just by thinking really, really carefully about what the word God means? I mean, it sounds impossible, right? But that's exactly what the ontological argument claims to do. So, in this explainer, we're going to follow the entire arc of this epic debate. First, we'll get into the whole idea of a proof from pure logic. Then we'll break down the perfect being argument itself. After that, we'll see the classic objections that almost killed it for good, check out its surprising modern comeback using something called possible worlds, and finally, we'll try to figure out if this idea is flawed, fascinating, or maybe a little bit of both. Okay, so most arguments for God, they rely on evidence. They point to the universe and how complex it is, or the fact that time had a beginning. But the ontological argument? Totally different. It's what philosophers call an a priori argument. All that means is it's based on reason alone. You don't need to go out and observe the world. Think of it more like a mathematical proof than a scientific theory. And this debate has been raging for centuries. It all starts way back in the 11th century with St. Anselm. Then it gets a huge reboot from René Descartes in the 17th century. Then, in the 18th, Immanuel Kant comes along and seems to deal it a fatal blow. But just when you think it's all over, it gets revived in the 20th century by a guy named Plantinga, using a whole new kind of logic. It's a real roller coaster.
All right, so what's the actual logic here? What did Anselm and Descartes think was so airtight? How could a simple idea prove something about reality? Well, it all hinges on a very, very specific definition of God. It all starts with Anselm's definition. He says, okay, just try to conceive of the greatest possible being you can imagine. Got it? Now here's the crucial move. He argues that a being that exists in reality is, obviously, greater than a being that exists only in your imagination. So if your greatest conceivable being was only in your mind, it wouldn't actually be the greatest, because you could always think of one that's even greater, one that actually exists. Centuries later, Descartes puts his own spin on it with this clean, four-step logic. He starts with the idea that a perfect being has to have all perfections. Makes sense. Then he says that existence itself is a perfection. I mean, it's better to exist than not to, right? Therefore, existence has to be part of God's very essence. For Descartes, trying to deny God's existence is as crazy as trying to imagine a triangle whose angles don't add up to 180 degrees. It's just a contradiction.
Now, for a long time, this argument felt incredibly powerful, almost like a magic trick. But pretty soon, other philosophers started to find what they thought were absolutely devastating flaws. The counterattacks began almost right away, and honestly, they came to define the next few hundred years of this whole debate. The first big takedown came from a fellow monk named Guanilo, who just brilliantly parodied Anselm's logic. He just swapped out the word being for island. He said, okay, I can conceive of the greatest possible island. It's full of treasure, perfect weather, the whole deal. An island that exists is greater than one that doesn't. Therefore, my perfect island must exist. And that's, well, it's clearly absurd. It shows there's a serious flaw in the original reasoning. You can't just define things into existence.
But the knockout punch, or so everyone thought, came from Immanuel Kant. Now, to get his point, let's just look at how we define something basic. A triangle, for instance. It's defined by its properties, what philosophers call predicates. It has 3 sides, 3 angles, and those angles add up to 180 degrees. These are all part of the concept of a triangle.
And here it is, Kant's killer objection. He argued that existence is not a property or a predicate like has 3 sides. When you say a triangle exists, you're not adding a new feature to its definition. You're making a claim that you can find an example of that concept out there in the real world. So you can't just sneak existence into a definition and then claim you've proven something actually exists. Game, set, match. Or so it seemed. For about 200 years, pretty much everyone agreed that Kant had put the final nail in the coffin. The ontological argument was this clever but ultimately failed thought experiment. But then, in the 20th century, it made a shocking comeback in a powerful new form, using the tools of modern logic. So, to understand this revival, you have to get your head around the concept of possible worlds. Now, don't worry, it's just a philosopher's tool for talking about different what-if scenarios. There's a possible world where you decided to be an astronaut, or a possible world where I'm speaking a different language right now. It's just a way to explore ideas of what's possible and what's necessary.
So the philosopher Alvin Plantinga takes this idea and totally reframes the argument. He says, let's think about a maximally great being. For a being to be truly maximally great, it wouldn't just be great in our world. Its greatness would mean it had to exist necessarily, which means it would have to exist in every single possible world. It couldn't possibly not exist.
And this whole complex argument really just comes down to one crucial starting point. Plantinga says, look, if you can just admit that the existence of a maximally great being is even possible, if there's just one possible world out there where it could exist, then, because of its very nature, it must exist in all worlds, and that includes our own. The whole thing hinges on whether you accept that one little premise. Is a maximally great being even a coherent possibility to begin with?
So, after a full millennium of debate, where does that leave us? Has the argument finally succeeded, or is it still just a very clever trick of logic? Let's take a look at what most philosophers think today, drawing on analysis from guys like J.L. Mackie.
So here's the verdict. Most agree that Plantinga's version is logically valid. That means if, and it's a big if you accept his premise, the conclusion has to follow. But it's not considered a successful proof, because it doesn't give you any independent reason to accept that crucial starting premise. It doesn't prove that a maximally great being is possible. It just shows you what would be true if it were.
So, as a proof that's supposed to convince a skeptic, the argument really fails. But, as the philosopher J.L. Mackie put it, as a fascinating piece of logical exploration, it's an absolute masterpiece. It just pushes the boundaries of logic and language and forces us to think really hard about what words like existence, perfection, and necessity even mean.
And that kind of leaves us with a final question, doesn't it? Maybe the real value of this 1,000-year duel isn't whether it proves anything. Maybe the question is this argument a failed attempt to prove God exists, or is it actually a brilliant, successful meditation on the very limits of what our own minds and our own logic can achieve? It's a debate that, in the end, tells us as much about ourselves as it does about anything else.